So as I mentioned, we'll now be moving into our next panel, a workshop style panel on encryption. We're going to be joined by encryption expert Alec Muffet, who's going to be giving us a deep dive into how the technologies work. And then our two panelists who are just taking their seats now will be Stephen Bonner, Executive Director of Regulatory Futures at the Information Commissioner's Office, and Dan Sexton, Chief Technology Officer at the Internet Watch Foundation. And they're going to be having a discussion on the merits and risks of encryption. So if everybody could please join me in welcoming to the stage Dan, Stephen, and Alec.
Is it possible to get some water? Good afternoon, everyone. I did spend the weekend trying to prepare a slide deck, but there was not logistical time to splice it into the mega deck which powers this day's events. So I've posted a link to a blog post containing it on Twitter. If you look for the UK IGF 22 hashtag, you'll find the post, and then it's a PDF which you can click through, or a YouTube test video I did last night as well. If you're bored of my voice, you can listen to it online instead. It'll be wonderfully virtual. So hello and welcome to the encryption workshop and panel session. I would like to talk about the 2nd of May in the year 2000, which was a pivotal day in the development and understanding of operational security. Because it was on that day in the year 2000 that the US President Bill Clinton invented Pokemon Go. Or rather, Clinton signed some paperwork which disabled some ostensible global safety technology and thereby unknowingly laid the foundations for Pokemon Go and much more to be invented. You see, from its inception in 1978 until May 2000, all civilian use of GPS was hampered by a precautionary principle design restriction called selective availability, where without access to a special kind of GPS receiver, one equipped with a classified, secret, regularly changed encryption key, lacking access to such a receiver meant that the location reported by your GPS system would be inaccurate. How inaccurate? Very inaccurate, up to 100 meters at times, which means that you could be sitting in this building, but your GPS would be telling you that you are standing on London Wall or walking down Moorgate towards Bank Station. That level of inaccuracy. The intention of this was safety. In 1978, it was decided that the general public could not be allowed to have accurate positioning information in case armies of anti-democratic nation states or in case terrorists amongst us would take off-the-shelf GPS hardware and build self-navigating cruise missiles and crash them into important buildings and assassinate political figures and so forth. With this insight, it's kind of ironic to reflect on this year's reports of Ukrainian drone operators dropping grenades and guiding artillery onto Russian tank formations in an impressive display of asymmetric warfare. Or not to mention the growing use of GPS to enforce geofencing, to keep quadcopters and other toys like that away from airport flight paths and away from jails and other buildings like that where it would present a security risk. It's curious to see that mechanism, which was considered dangerous, being used for a safety role. So, however well-intentioned it was, selective availability had inherent massive negative economic and military consequences. The military secret GPS receivers were rare and they required special handling because of their special features. And the encryption key material even more so because it was a real secret. They were more expensive to produce. It was challenging to put large numbers of them into the field. And so much so that it fundamentally compromised the whole intention of GPS as a solution for the military. During the first Gulf War, troops begged their families to send them commercial GPS units because the Navstar units, which the government, the army was using, were largely unavailable, 2 per 100 vehicles. And yet these GPS devices were meant to be a key preventative in stopping friendly fire incidents. So at least you knew where you were and your mates wouldn't shoot you. So the troops decided in such a crush, any location data is better than no location data at all, and decided to use civilian units even though they were inaccurate. Also, the overhead of standards and compliance meant that the military receivers didn't track advancements in user interface, didn't track advancements in display technologies, nor improvements in accuracy, which featured in the commercial units, largely as an attempt to bypass selective availability by integrating other navigation beacons or averaging locations over time, that kind of thing. So in function and practice, selective availability was doomed, and it was disposed of with the actual hardware capability being expunged from the GPS specification, from the requirements for new satellites and so forth, by the Bush White House in 2007. But, and this is where we get towards the theme for today, what if the world's governments had forbidden civilian circumvention of selective availability? And what if it had never been switched off? In that case, here in 2022, we would have no Pokemon Go. We would have no geocaching, no location-based games to keep the kids amused, no decent in-car navigation, no Uber, no Deliveroo, no gig economy to speak of, probably, at least all the things that are involved delivering in a timely fashion to households. No Google Street View, and most especially no user-generated content on Google Street View. There would be no sharing your location. There would be no finding your family. There would be no, finding your family using WhatsApp or something to share your location when you're in a crowd in a big open space or something like that, so everybody can find out where you are. If you're the sort of person to track your child with technology when they're leaving school or whatever, we'd never do that if we care about privacy, of course, there would be none of that either. There'd be no child geofencing. The likes of AirTags and Tile, they probably wouldn't exist either. They'd be considerably less useful. There would be no decent stolen car tracking. That would be much diminished. No speed camera alerts if you're the sort of person to care about such things. No automatic recording of walking routes for hikers, which sounds very pedestrian until you realize that probably means there would be no OpenStreetMap either, and all of the other things which OpenStreetMap provides to the internet as a service. We would all still be in hoc to Ordnance Survey for British mapping. There would be no precision location for hikers and boats and pilots, and there would be no precision crop spraying because we would have no means to prevent excessive use of fertilizer, excessive use of water and of insecticide, and the chemical runoff would dump into the water table, into groundwater systems and so forth. So we would have no reduction in pollution either. We'd have no location tagging of photos. We would have no searching of photo albums by location, no photo-based open source intelligence, no solution to a bunch of crimes, including the open source intelligence, which helped prove the downing of Malaysian Air Flights 17. This is just a selection of the things we wouldn't have. A full list would be enormous if selective availability was still active. A huge and rich ecosystem of tools that we take for granted would simply not exist. And worse, we would have no idea that it should exist by now. We would be living in something of a void that we just did not know was not meant to be there. So, on that happy note, my name is Alec, and welcome to this panel on encryption, except this is not really a panel on encryption. When I was approached to chair this session, my brief was to provide a workshop-style panel to explain and demonstrate encryption to the public. It will include a deep dive into how technologies work, and participants, you all, will be shown how to secure your digital environment, what to expect when submitting information securely to third parties, what strong encryption means, and this will be followed by a debate between panelists on the merits and risks of encryption. Well, I've done this a lot in the past 32 years or so, and nowadays it's a lot easier to explain, but probably won't go as the organizers intended. Encryption should look like your vintage SMS or phone or video chat applications, but much nicer. Likely, it should not cost anything to use. And importantly, governments and telecommunications industry lobbyists should be very angry about it. All of the other encryption that you use, like the tiny little end-to-end encrypted cloud of your devices, your phone and tablets and smartwatches and fitness trackers, all sharing bookmarks and payment information and other data amongst themselves, you probably don't even realize that it's there. Although you should realize that it's there, or at least know that it's there, so that you can keep an eye out for journalists telling you that something is broken or wrong with it. But then you have to fact check the journalists to find out whether they are fibbing or not, because a lot of journalists do that when they get really excited about encryption. Also, regrettably, most people don't really need to know how encryption works. There is no pressing obligation for a normal human being to be able to explain super-singular isogeny Diffie-Hellman key exchange and why it is suddenly a bad idea. So I'm not going to do that. The question of how to secure your digital environment is much more interesting, although it immediately raises another question, which is from whom? Because without answer to this, we cannot meaningfully respond to it. And everybody in this room is extraordinarily diverse in what their threat model is. For you, it's a matter of what do you need to protect, but that is going to be very different from a teenager in the United States trying to pursue an abortion. This is going to be very different from a women's rights activist in Iran who needs to get at a secure communications channel, but one which will not incriminate them and hasn't been blocked. This is different to whoever our foreign secretary is this week and whether they have been hacked, and if so, by which nation state, and should they have had the data in the first place. In summary, the only legitimate answer to how to secure your environment is it depends. It depends on who you are, and that's a case-by-case issue. So we've covered 3 things so far. Explaining and demonstrating encryption. It should be like an app, but better. How encryption works, don't. And how to secure your environment. It depends. The next question, though, is actually something we can probably access more easily. What do people expect when submitting information securely to third parties? The answer is extraordinarily straightforward. People expect, when they submit information securely to third parties, that it will not be seen, scanned, nor processed by fourth parties. The technical word for this is trust. And it's what people actually care about. What they actually expect is that their credit card details will not be ripped off and cloned when they are in transit to the Tesco website buying a shopping basket of groceries or something like that. For that matter, they care that it is really Tesco or one of their approved partners who is on the other end of that shopping basket with the little padlock icon in it inside your browser. It depends on, you really care about what website you are surfing. That is part of trust. Similarly, people expect that iCloud or Google, 5 minutes to what? Okay. People expect that iCloud or Google Chrome syncing will not leak their passwords nor their personal information. Similarly, and more importantly for messaging, people expect that their messages will only be read by those people they intend, not by hackers, not by platform employees, not by government spies, nor covert law enforcement. From people's basic expectations, we can then derive the most fundamental moral and political questions of modern information technology. And those then define what is strong encryption. Encryption which meets the obligations that people put on it for trust. That is strong encryption. And this provides also a firm foundation about which we may reason in the construction of innovation. So when I was approached to chair this session, I was asked if I have an organization which I work for or represent, which I could list on the website as part of the agenda. And this is presumably meant as a kindness to attendees so that they can work out who to cheer and boo. I don't have anything like that for the past 2 years. I'm a full-time stay-at-home dad. I'm a primary carer, I change nappies, I do all of the laundry, I do most of the cleaning, large amounts of the cooking, wipe snotty noses, read books, sing songs, ferry my daughter back and forth to activities, play peekaboo. And so I suggested to the organizers that maybe they could put me down as a consultant. Evidently, this was not quite what they were looking for. Everyone on the agenda, bless them, everyone on the agenda suddenly gained improved speaker biographies, reflecting some of what they do and what they have achieved, rather than simply who they work for. And in doing so, the organizers implicitly made an important point for me, which is that we need to stop talking about abstract labels and talk instead about impact. And so in the same spirit, I would like to open up and reframe this session. I don't want this to be a session about encryption. I wanted this to be a session on giving people everywhere greater privacy, assurance, and confidence, and enabling them to keep secrets, even from the state. This does not dilute the gravity of what we are going to talk about in this panel. The ability to keep a secret is really dangerous. And the abilities to speak and share secrets in secret, share ideas in secret rather, are even more dangerous. These capabilities can assist disruption, they can assist conspiracy, cause or help assist and foment genuine harms, they can undermine accountability, and they can enable bad people to do bad things. Note well though, everything that I've just listed is assistance, because it's entirely possible and even quite commonplace to be a malicious actor or an abuser or a troll using unencrypted clear text communication, in fact, doing stuff face to face even, with or without anonymity. All of those things are optional except the doing abuse and harm bit. In this world, there are a small number of people who are very, very genuinely bad people who would use greater privacy as they would any other public facility to do bad things. To be adults in an open society, we need to understand that and to discuss cost-benefit analysis of giving people everywhere greater privacy and assurance and confidence and enabling them to keep secrets even from the state. Just as with selective availability for GPS, we are in fear of a novel technical capability which may be used to cause atrocious harms. But currently, nobody is advocating for the other side of the balance scale. And this is bad because not merely do I believe our fears are massively overblown and our proposed remedies disproportionate, but they also keep us from recognizing the unobvious future innovations that will probably stand on our giving people greater privacy, assurance, and confidence, and allowing them to keep secrets even from the state. The tools that we will otherwise be missing. To reframe a popular cliche, which I've had in online safety discussions, we need to consider the balance between safety and the vast multitude of things which can be achieved and harms which can be avoided by giving people privacy, assurance, and confidence and enabling them to keep secrets even from the state. Which would you choose? Safety or your grandmother's credit card details not being exfiltrated as part of a dump? At scale for millions, if not billions, of grandmothers around the world. It's an emotive subject. Some people will state a deep-seated belief in the precautionary principle and balancing liberties, and they will say things like, if just one child is saved, then any amount of inconvenience will be worth it. So it's important to know for what follows that earlier this year, the Home Office ran a 540 something thousand pound, £540,000 publicity campaign to lobby against encryption. One what? Until what? Oh, it's going to go. We're just doing it. The big number on this website, on the website associated with it. Oh, yeah, good. Are we done then? Okay. Well, we can do, but we're not going to. The big number on the website was 14 million reports of child sexual abuse could be lost through encryption. 14 million was quoted out of context, and it was a number that was quoted to get you angry. When you look at some reports from Meta, you start to see an actual story of from a sample set of abuse that was sent to NECMEC, 90% of it was duplicates, and 75% of the accounts that were sharing supposedly abusive material were not actually potentially abusive. They appeared to not be malicious in any way whatsoever. So if you don't believe Meta, then you can read GCHQ's own recent analysis, which provided similar numbers, that 29 million reports were made of abusive material, but it ends with 8,700 UK children being safeguarded in 2001. That's a ratio, if ratios were meaningful at all, of 0.03. So the GCHQ paper, on the other hand, doesn't go so far as to mention the final outcomes. According to government figures for the same year, 2021, only 1,900 children had protection plans that applied to them for sexual abuse. And this contrasts badly with 24,000 plans for neglect and 19,000 for emotional abuse. We have a big social problem with childcare, and although tech is huge in children's lives, it is not the big societal issue. Care is. But the only problem, the other problem with heroically wanting to save one child is that it simply doesn't work. If we look at lockdown, for the last 10 years or so, the number of people who've been killed or seriously injured on the roads has been flat at about 30,000. For 2020, the year 2020, 6,800 people were killed in road accidents and so forth on British roads. That's an argument for restoring lockdown. But we're not having that discussion. It's a concrete manifest good. We could, over a course of a decade, save 26,000 children and perhaps 68,000 people from being killed on the roads. But we don't reimpose lockdown to do that. Because
Alec, I'm incredibly sorry to interrupt, but as compare, it is my job to keep us to time. So if we could move...
I'll stop here, but the thing is,
I know that you've made.
Context to work from.
I know that you've made your presentation available online on Twitter, which is wonderful.
I will direct everyone, please, to go check.
That will be wonderful.
The last part of it.
So with that, I think we can open our workshop style panel. We've got about half an hour left, but maybe we can push that to 3 p.m. just so that we've got enough time for a productive discussion. So Dan and Stephen, perhaps you could prepare some opening remarks, or Alec, you could start with that. Fantastic, thank you.
So, the question for my fellow panelists. Should a young black man growing up in London be permitted to have communications that are secure against digital stop and search until such time as a warrant is provided to go through their devices? That's it.
Fascinating question, but not the subject of today. So perhaps we could
how is it not
stay on the topic of the subject for today.
How is it? Please, how is it not the subject for today?
I'm interested in Dan's views on how we can, you've as the chair, you presented to us this idea of a dichotomy. This we can either have privacy or we can have safety. I'm keen to hear Dan's views on that topic, and perhaps I can respond to some of those.
I know we're not talking about what encryption is, but the first point is just that encryption is incredibly important. The internet wouldn't work without it. I mean, effectively, the internet is like this whole room. Everyone here is talking. How do I talk to Adam at the back there across this public space without everyone else hearing what I'm saying? Well, that's what encryption does. It gives us the ability to pass information across a public space, effectively, that Adam can read without everyone else reading it on the way there. It wouldn't work without it. Hugely important. But as far as the impact on our work, so the IWF is dedicated to finding and removing child sexual abuse online. The problem is when we brought in encryption, no one thought, well, what if I start passing images and videos of children being sexually abused across these public spaces? Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that to happen. That's not what it was supposed to do. It's supposed to be enable that communication, which it does. You can't take it away, otherwise we can't have conversations. The internet stops working. The challenge is, I know this is a challenge for regulators like Steve and our colleagues from Ofcom here, is how do you get that balance right to enable those private communications, enable the internet to work, but stop really harmful content. And child sexual abuse is objectively bad. It's illegal almost everywhere, and almost everybody agrees it's something that should be stopped. It should not exist. So what I would really like to explore is how can you ensure you continue to have privacy enhancing technologies which enable those communications without all of that surveillance and monitoring, but can stop that sort of harmful content being hosted and distributed online.
So you want to surveil without being surveilled?
Or to stop child sexual abuse material from entering ecosystems, exiting ecosystems, and existing on the internet as much as we can do that. And I think everybody would like to do that. We talked about what do people want. Do people want child sexual abuse material on the internet? Nobody wants to be exposed to that. No one has it sent to them, and certainly no one wants it to happen to their own children and distributed online.
I think in our work, you mentioned no one is arguing for encryption. That's part of our core role. As one of our strategy objectives is to improve cybersecurity online, including wide adoption of encryption. But we do that. I think one of the things we strongly believe in our work is that it's easy to present it as this dichotomy, one or the other. Actually, we need to find solutions that do both. And that's where we're putting our time and effort, working with other organizations who bring their expertise. But we see that there are mechanisms we can, in an end-to-end encrypted environment, provide protection and safety. And actually, some of those mechanisms involve eliminating harms at source. So one of the teams I'm most proud of the work in the ICO is the team that brought in Children's Code, the ADC, which is focused on not protecting children from the online world, but designing elements of it that are suitable for children to use, better designed for their usage. And through the deployment of that code, we've seen some of the largest platforms do things like move children's accounts to private by default. So they can't be found in search. Their content is not available to people who aren't already in their friends and family. And this reduces the chances of them being targeted. It doesn't eliminate the issue, but it adds a little bit of friction. And we think everywhere we can add a bit of friction to this kind of behavior will improve things. We've seen on another platform, they've turned off direct messaging for those between 13 and 15. And if you're 16 to 17, it's off by default, and you have to actively turn it on to accept those direct messages from others. And that, again, we think is the kind of behavior that platforms can do in a protected environment, reducing the risk of some of these behaviors that we don't want to see.
But how does that relate to encryption?
Well, I think there are those who would say we shouldn't have encryption because not having encryption is the only way to reduce the risk of these things. I think our challenge is, I think that's a false dichotomy. But there are mechanisms like adding friction to that element. There are things like our work with the Safety Tech Challenge to look at, are there mechanisms in which we can provide content moderation in an environment where you can't see the content.
So the ICO's role is evolving from giving people more privacy to trying to make sure they don't have too much. Because if they have too much privacy, they could share whatever they liked, and that would be bad.
But I think
you can, you should be able to do these things without compromising privacy.
But that requires a redefinition of privacy to mean a fourth party gets to say what data may or may not, gets to check, and also to receive a audit trail of what information was sent from A to B. Which is I think something that it's accepted in real life. You can't just take anything anywhere. You can't get on a plane with a gun and a bomb. They have checks there to stop that from happening, to protect the people on that plane, to stop sort of harmful things happening. I think what we find is in public, people understand that is a compromise to that level of privacy. I can carry whatever I want, wherever I want, no matter what it does, and a level of safety for yourself and those around you. And data is a bomb, is a gun, data is a bomb.
Child sexual abuse material is a gun and is a bomb, and shouldn't be allowed into messaging environments in the same way you shouldn't be allowing harmful, dangerous content onto planes. And I think that there has to be that compromise there. And the thing is that the privacy is a right, but it is not an absolute right. It does not override other rights. We have rights as a child. We have rights to safety. What it needs to do is those rights need to work together, and they need to flex. And you need to have the ability, when the harm is greatest, to be able to flex privacy to accommodate safety. And I think that's one of the things. It's not an absolutist argument.
So scroll forward to the year 2040. And my daughter is 19 years old at university and working on something like a Panama Papers journalism project or some climate activism or something like that. And it's doing political firebrand things. And she asks me to justify why she no longer has the online privacy that she needs in order to do these jobs, because it was taken away in the name of protecting her when she was a child, and that was supposed to mean my job. What do I tell her?
well, perhaps you tell her that those 11-year-old girls that we see the content who have been groomed online, have sexual abuse material circulated amongst them across encrypted environments with no form of recourse, no way of getting that content off. It's to protect them. It's protect those children out there where there are children that we know of that have had content produced of them 20 years ago. Those children are no longer children, and their content is still online. We still see it on a daily basis. This kind of stuff coming out. And how do you say to those children, adults as they are now, why is no one taking this content down? Because we can. So we know what it is. We can find it everywhere that you can see that can be removed. And how do we justify to those people? We said no, because my privacy is more important than your safety. And I don't think that's a justifiable argument.
But everyone's privacy might be.
And everyone's safety and safety of children. If you judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable, then you'd be judging it based on some of the panels we saw earlier, how we treat the young, how we treat the old, how we treat those that are at highest at risk. And I would give up some of my privacy to protect the safety of my children online. So,
do you know if your children in 20 years hence would do that?
I think the point we're trying to make is you don't have to, right? That's where we should be putting our effort and thought, is how do we achieve both these outcomes? And we can dig into our trenches and throw things at each other over why it's not possible, it can't possibly be done, or we can exert time and effort into thinking, okay, we want a future in which people can be political firebrands as they wish, and the environment is safe for children and their content is not, they're not being groomed, they're not being exploited, their content is not persisting in a way that causes them ongoing harm. And I don't think that there is a trade-off here. You can get into trade-offs. You can say, no, actually, we want to have systems and a mechanism that provides both. That's difficult. It requires new ways of thinking. It requires potentially new technologies, but they are achievable. We are at the cusp of being able to do these things so that we can, we're talking about it in the green room, Dan's been looking at privacy enhancing technologies and how they can be used so that without having a list of all the content, without generating maps of patterns of life that would allow people, would infringe on people's privacy, you can still say this particular content cannot exist in this environment. And that, we think, is where the future really lies here, that will give you that.
Yep, I agree. I think actually encryption, although there are some dangers to encryption, but it also presents, I think, some of the solutions to those challenges. I think there is a light there somewhere. There is the ability to do things like, as Microsoft does in the Edge browser, it can tell you if your password has been compromised without knowing what your password is and without knowing what the compromised passwords are. That ability to be able to do that sort of blocking and behavior matching without knowing either source, that exists. That's a thing that can be done. And it's the sort of thing that could keep people safe online without impinging on privacy and actually balance both of those things. And I absolutely agree with it. It's not about getting into those discussions about one or the other. We shouldn't have to make those statements because we'll end up pigeonholing people or organizations into you're for one thing and one for another. The mission of the IGF is a safer internet for all. A safer internet for all means privacy and it means safety for children. Both of those things need to coexist. We wouldn't ever want to have to compromise one for the other.
And yet every check that you make of a database in order to check that this piece of content is permitted, is not in some way illegal, creates an audit trail which can then be retrospectively analyzed in order to create a list of all the documents you've ever seen at some point further down the road.
It could build a system that did that, and that would be disproportionate. It would not have data minimization. It would not comply with the requirements of us as a regulator. You can also
it's an implementation option, right? So you could choose not to do that.
Yeah, you could instead use zero knowledge proof to.
You could just not record that.
Yeah, and then you have to trust. You have to trust that the government, that the government and the security services will not misuse and abuse data. And yet, for some reason, we look at the platforms and say, oh no, Facebook couldn't possibly do this sort of thing because it will just go and advertise on the back of this metadata that they are collecting. Why is the government more trustworthy in this respect, especially given how, for instance, the regulation of Investigatory Powers Act privileges have been abused to chase fly tippers when they were meant to fight terrorists?
Well, as the independent regulator, we oversight both of government and commercial platforms. We do have an unfortunate track record of finding particularly commercial platforms who collect things like, we'll use this phone number just for two-factor authentication and actually used it for marketing. And we and other regulators have taken robust action that have encouraged organizations like that it will really harm your bottom line if you don't take it seriously.
But the answer is independent regulators. The whole government
definitely helps.
And then following a very nice podcast with Jonathan Sumption on the Law podcast a couple of weeks ago, he asked, at what point will the regulators stop taking direction from governments if it becomes illegal?
I think we have a series of other checks and balances in a mature democracy. The regulators certainly form part of that, but I think if that is your sole barrier, we're a good team at the ICO, but I'm not sure we can.
So for instance, this would not be used to prevent refugees coming to the United Kingdom.
So what is it exactly is that you're suggesting will be used?
What I'm suggesting is not so much what it,
because a lot of those technologies already exist, it's already being used, and it's not doing any of those things now. So why would it start doing those things in the future? For instance, proactive detection of child sexual abuse material is widely used across the industry and has been for a decade.
The reason it would start being used in the future is because we are in an evolving environment where end-to-end encryption is being used to reduce the risk profile and to mean that only the people, the first and second parties in a conversation, get to see the content that third parties do not. And the mechanisms which you're discussing here would then start with, for instance, imagery and photos and checking that it was not CSAM or something like that, and then can be repurposed for any.
So you worked with Facebook Messenger. Now proactive detection is currently active on Facebook Messenger, which is not end-to-end encrypted. Has any of that
Except for
happened?
the bit that, sorry?
So none of those things have happened in Facebook Messenger so far. Why would it start happening there?
How do you know they haven't happened? Under Section 702 Foreign Intelligence Services Act, Facebook are obligated to provide to at least the United States government any information which is sent through from the FBI. And it isn't known by the employees whether that is being looked for.
You're saying there are democratically elected governments that have selected legitimate systems with oversight to gain access to confidential data to pursue criminal investigations, particularly those of national security, because I think that's pretty much what a mature, grown-up civilization does. We've been doing that.
And yet, for some reason,
for a couple of thousand years, you used to, people, many of the mechanisms that we're recreating online are two people sitting in a pub having a chat. Right?
If it was something which we could so easily gloss over, we wouldn't have Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 regarding the protection of information pertaining to European citizens because of Section 702.
But that's democracies disagreeing about levels of extent and degree, and they are resolving those issues.
And speaking of nation states disagreeing, if we have such a mechanism for British purposes, what's to stop the Russians from using the same backdoor and obligating Facebook, Meta, whomever, to take the British mechanism and use it to quell dissent in Russia?
There's a lot to unpack in that.
There is.
What you're postulating there. Let's start with some basics.
Would you prefer Iran?
No one is proposing a backdoor. It's one of the most encouraging things we've had in this debate. As the usually regulator, we take a fairly bold position on this. We are fundamentally pro the kind of benefits that these systems provide, and we've been delighted to get very strong support and insight from our partners across government around. They're not looking to add a backdoor precisely because backdoors often reduce the level of security in things that then are misused by criminal actors, sometimes used to target the very children that we're often concerned about, is that these kind of systems can be misused. There was that terrible case where the law enforcement access on some of the big social media platforms, attackers were socially engineering urgent requests from law enforcement that weren't actually from law enforcement, gaining access to personal data was then being used to secure children. And that kind of those systems that are added can be abused, and knowledge of that and response to it is vital for reducing the risk. But no one is suggesting there should be backdoors into these systems. That has historically been approached suggesting things like the Clipper chip in the 90s, but actually a level of understanding, as in the wonderful extensive example you gave us about GPS, we found that there are ways to achieve the benefits here. If you buy a GPS chip and put it in a cruise missile, it won't work, and not because of restrictions on broadcast.
It's interesting, the
There's a speed
GPS,
limit on it.
Alex mentioned the air tags. I think it's a good example there of misuse.
Mhm.
So when technologists create things, they create things with good intentions, and they don't tend to think, what would a really bad person use for this? And you probably know the case of the air tags. They're being used for stalking. So people are taking air tags and they're putting on particularly for women, putting them in cars and purses to track those people. So that extra accuracy from that GPS, which you're very, very proudly talking about earlier, that's being used to stalk and abuse women now.
And it's
That
been-
wasn't the intended effect of air
No.
tags, but that's what they're doing with it. And I think the thing with encryption is no one intended with encryption that it would be used for passing around images and videos of children being sexually abused. But it is. It's enabling that. And what we need to do is go, well, that encryption is good, but this is bad. We need to stop that. We need to stop the air tags being used for stalking women, and you need to stop child sexual abuse material for effectively encryption being abused to do harmful things. But that's not a case of not doing encryption. It's not a case of putting backdoors in. It's adapting the technology to prevent harm.
The thing that you're describing is called dual use. And I'm very familiar with it from 1990, 91, where encryption was deemed such a threat that because the Russians might get a hold of it and start using it against America, for instance, that the United States put export restrictions on encryption, and it was not possible to get a hold of it for these reasons, which hampered industry. It hampered the development of secure transport protocols, IPsec, and web protocols later, and has been a cause of security vulnerabilities ever since. It's very much a case of, in trying to protect, you also wind up defeating the value proposition of the thing itself.
I just want to come back to another point you made, Alec, about the small number of people. The NCA said that there is between 550 and 850,000 people in the UK that pose a sexual threat to children.
Mhm.
Do you consider that a small number of people?
Yes. What else do you expect me to say to a challenge like that?
Honestly, it was a rhetorical question. That's not a small number of people. That's a very large amount of people who pose a sexual threat to children.
Mhm. And
Hi,
how many
Alec.
of them have acted on it?
Hi, Alec. Apologies. Could it be right if we can move to questions from the floor and on?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Isabella's going to support on that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We've got about 10 minutes for a Q&A session. Again, we'll be doing questions from everyone in person and also really encouraging people online to get involved. We've covered some really important, mostly contentious areas, covering everything from trust, finding, a balance, or, trying to move beyond false dichotomies in this debate, building a safer internet for all, whether privacy is an absolute right and how privacy evolves and has evolved over the past 10, 20 years, what privacy might look like for our children's generations and their children's future generations. So I'll just take a look to see if there's anyone. Can I go to you for the first question and then get you afterwards? Thanks.
Sure. Andrew Campling. Interesting discussion. I think you maybe, if you wanted to look at technological solutions to resolve the supposed dichotomy, there are such things now as zero-proof middle boxes, which can examine encrypted content without decrypting it. And there's some interesting research in that area currently, and that's getting close to commercial sort of viability, so based on the research from some various universities. But dare I say, you're, in my mind, completely falsely equating encryption and privacy. And I think that's a wrong starting point. And by way of an example, where the internet industry at the moment is really pushing to get so-called end-to-end encryption through various protocols, part of the discussion we'll be having in London next week is how some of those proposed new protocols will actually weaken privacy, because actually they weaken cybersecurity. And it's too long a conversation to have now, but basically they let malware onto your device. So you, ultimately, some of the initiatives to strengthen privacy allegedly will ultimately weaken it if they're allowed to go forward in an unfettered way. So I'm not sure there's a question here, but I mean, the point is it's a lot more complicated than encryption equals privacy and therefore is good. There's plenty of evidence out there that encryption can weaken privacy, so it's not a given. So I challenge the basic premise.
So if I could just turn to the panel and ask them to keep their responses under a minute if possible, so that we can squeeze in as many questions as we can. If I could just go from left to right, so I could start with Stephen, Dan, and then Alec, if you have any comments at the end, and then we're going to go to the gentleman over there for the next question.
I think we absolutely accept this is a fast-moving and complicated area. There are details matter in this, and it's easy to fall into emotive calls to arms around this rather than actually looking at the detail. We are engaged in many of those new protocols and mechanisms, trying to make sure, but the lack of visibility for good also protects lack of visibility for bad, and that is a way we have to work out. Similar to the detection of the kind of most extreme content, it's similar for spam and potential malware in these environments. Many of the mechanisms we have to moderate content currently require access to the content, and that those are going to have to change. And that, yeah, you're exactly right. That's a topic of extensive research and change at the moment, and we're fully engaged and interested to see what comes out from that.
Yeah, I agree, Andrew. There's an element of encryption of it's not just good or bad, it's how you use it. It is important. There's been a kind of a rejection of any sort of detection or filtering of being positive in any form, and that's not true. So filtering of malware, filtering of viruses, filtering of child sexual abuse material, these are positive things. And actually, if you go too far to one side, you can't do any of those. And then actually, you do potentially put people at more risk. So you've sort of gone from people with no privacy, a lot of risk, to a kind of a sweet spot potentially where you're getting a good level of privacy, but you're also be able to protect them to potentially end up reintroducing those risks later by taking away those abilities. So I agree with Stephen. It's complex, it's fast moving. And it's not a binary issue. It is very much, it's not just how, it's not just what you do, it's how you use it and where you use it.
Andrew's position is that if encryption is strong between server and client, bad things may be sent from server to client. If the client is more and better resistant and checks what things arrive in the way that my colleagues here would say it ought to be done somewhere by a man in the middle, then there is no increased problem. Oh, yeah.
Sounds like a conversation to continue in the break. Now hand over to the gentleman over there for your question.
Hello, yes. Thank you for what was quite an oddly fascinating discussion that you had. I really appreciate the passion that you're showing, and I really appreciate your responses was fire. You were under fire, and you sort of responded back. I think it was a very good conversation, although it was a little uncomfortable, if I'm being honest.
Try this side.
So
is what we aim for every day.
my question, the backdoor question, is that an argument that has been won? Is it over in government circles, or will it be a new minister or a new government and it will come up again? We had the ID issue came around several times. Is this a backdoor thing? Will it come up again, or is it an argument that has actually been completed, that it's agreed it's not going to work? And then the other question I have is, what kinds of buckets of solutions are there for this intractable problem of how do you maintain encryption, which I agree is a GPS issue. How do you maintain it, but how do you deal with these problems? What are the buckets of solutions that we are looking at?
We'll do the same format as last time, but this time we'll go my left to right. So Alex, do you want to go ahead, followed by Dan and Stephen?
I'd prefer to go the other way. No, seriously, I'm still thinking that one over.
So I think none of the debates around this are ever finished. That's part of living in a vibrant democracy, possibly more vibrant than some of us want at the moment in terms of changing direction. But we, as an organisation that's positioned and shared knowledge, there's a paper we published early in the year around our view on how to frame this discussion and engage with it. And we had very positive engagement. And there were specific things. We've seen UK government support for strong encryption, the NCSC guidance, our own work, the regulatory requirements in the will require organizations to deploy encryption at transit and in rest to protect information because it's a cost-effective and highly effective mechanism to support that. So there's that side of things. In terms of backdoors, when we wrote that paper, they explicitly asked us to add a quote to resolve that issue, saying HMG is not looking to undermine security in end-to-end platforms, for instance, by introducing backdoors. So they've gone on the record very publicly that's not the approach that they're taking. Clearly, that may change in the future, but I think it's an incredibly positive step. And when we look back to the history of this topic, there were definitely times where there was an actively proposed and engaged mechanism to say the right answer here is to stop export of this technology. It is to add backdoors. It is to build these mechanisms, and the debate has moved on. And then now we see a very high consensus that generally managing the risks around that has to be done. It's not an unavoided good, but that by deploying robust systems, we protect ourselves from cyber attacks, from predators looking to target and intercept information, looking to impersonate other people. And this generally is a good. We then have to work on the potential negatives of that and make sure they're managed. But I am quite comfortable that the proposed approaches from government have moved on a great deal from where we were 20 years ago. And that is a positive thing. And it shows an understanding of the critical benefit that these kind of privacy provides, but that safety is important as well. And we're seeing the kind of mechanisms that allow us to provide safety in that end-to-end encrypted environment. That has to be the right answer. I think I may have gone over 1 minute. Apologies, but I'm quoting HMG on that one, so they can.
Unless Dan and Alec have a response to that question in particular, we actually have 3 questions from online participants, and I really want to make sure that they are explored. Elise, could you possibly combine some of these questions because we are running a little bit of time?
I will do my best. I will do my best. Firstly, Alec, can we please have your Twitter handle, and participants online would like to have a look.
Alec Muffet, one word. ALEC-MUFFETT.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And I also have a question from Jen Pearson from Defend Digital Me. Some of the UK safety tech sector, as applied today in the public sector, libraries, hospitals, schools, means a company like this example, sorry, she's supplied a link, can access users' bank details or passwords. Should the public not expect secure use of online systems anymore? The workarounds and encryption like this is how safety tech works by design.
Could I go to Dan first, if that's all right? And then followed by Alex and Stephen, if you'd like to comment on this, but if not, if there's another question.
I think so. What we've been discussing today is that there shouldn't be that dichotomy between you can have one thing or the other. We should be exploring and making use of encryption to enable things like matching of harmful content without exposing user data. So that's actually where the issues go. So encryption is here; it's essential. End to end, I think, is more complex. There's more concern. I think there's less benefit. The harm to benefit ratio is different than end to end, but at the same time, it's here, it's popular, it's coming out. What we need to be doing is looking at ways of minimizing harm, reducing harm on those platforms without exposing data. So it's not a dichotomy. You should be able to expect your privacy, but you should also be able to expect that harmful content is also not being distributed online. So both of those things. I realize that's a bit of having your cake and eat it, but yeah, that's what we should be doing.
Alex, any comments? Or?
I just add that your product is aiming to achieve a safety goal, does not exempt it from privacy requirements. So we would expect to see that users shouldn't have to give up the details of their bank details in order to have content monitoring. There are perfectly sensible products that manage to deal with that issue.
I agree with Dan that it is cakeism. The ability to filter or block or be an intermediary for other people's information being shared from one person to another is a form of blocking and interception. It is a backdoor into it, because if you can play around with the filter, you can find out or block certain pieces of content and thereby infer information about what was transferred. I believe that the elephant in the room that nobody is addressing is why we do not try to fix society when we pursue technical solutions to forms of abuse and other risks like fraud and so forth. Because
how to put this.
I'll come back to it in a second.
Well, luckily we're about to break for coffee.
Okay.
So I think that is my mic on? Sorry, I can see it's off. Is that better? So we're about to do a 15-minute break for coffee, so I'm sure we have many interesting conversations and thoughts to pick up on. I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking our workshop style panel for a very interesting discussion. So we will be reconvening here in about, if the team is all right with this, maybe we could reconvene at 3:15 instead for our next panel on transparency and AI. So see you all very shortly and see our online participants then as well. Thank you.